The last threat is called social emotional learning. And this is where the schools are trying to take a set of values and impose it into the conscience of the children in the school. As soon as you don't hold those values, you get sent to the counselor's office and you need to get corrective training and corrective guidance. And well, maybe you as the parent are the one that is against this, so we're going to take the children away from you through Child Protective Services.
In our times, the conversation about who should be in charge of raising our kids seems to have reached its peak. We have grown accustomed to a society built to cater to all our needs from the cradle to the grave. And abdicating our responsibility in exchange for a bit of safety and happiness has become the new norm. This includes the invitation to let others educate our children, as if they are firstly members of our society and only then our kids. It takes a village to raise a child has turned from an adage highlighting the impact of society on the development of children into an unwritten rule about the need to move the responsibility of raising them into the hands of the government. How exactly do we react? One side insists on raising the children according to their own values and principles. The other side insists on protecting the kids of others from bad ideas and dangerous values. The great professor and economist Thomas Sowell once said, "Education is not merely neglected in many of our schools today, but it is replaced to a great extent by ideological indoctrination." But this raises the question, who in fact is in charge of education and who exactly does the indoctrination? Here at Edictum Dei, our purpose is not to decide who is right and who is wrong. Our goal is to have an informed conversation on such hot topics to help you form your own opinion. I am Matei and I will be the host of this interview. Today's podcast will be a conversation facilitated by the internet. That is because our guest was kind enough to respond to our invitation even though he is far away in California. Nonetheless, this detail makes him even more qualified to speak on the topic of who raises our children in the age of internet and propaganda. George ROŠCA was born in Romania, yet he spent most of his life in the land of opportunities, the United States of America. That is where he went to school, where he works, and where he raises his children. He is a civil engineer and a manager in one of the largest engineering companies in the United States, but also a founding member of Protect Our Kids. George, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to have this extremely necessary conversation.
Mate, thank you so much for having me on.
It's our pleasure to have you here. Could you tell us a little bit more about your journey from communist Romania to the freedom of the United States and what led you to establish Protect Our Kids?
Yeah, so I was born in Romania back in 1991, before my seventh birthday. My parents, who are also Christians, my dad's the eldest of 10 in his family. I'm the eighth of 12 in my family. Um, and so being heavily persecuted for the faith and serving prison time as well in Romania, my dad decided that, you know what, enough is enough. He doesn't want his children to live in that kind of a country. But unfortunately, it took a very long time from the time he started trying to the time when we were able to come. So September of 1991, we were able to come over to America, came straight into first grade. The school year had just started. So basically my entire academic career has been in the public schools of America, because my parents didn't know anything else, and also with 12 kids, it was impossible for anything else as well. So I grew up, finished top of my class in high school, which allowed me to get into some of the more prestigious universities in America. I finished my bachelor's in civil engineering, went on to get my master's in business administration. And in the meantime, I was also doing my seminary through church. I always had a very strong and grounded faith in God that came from my parents instilling those values in us. And then also, one year I went back to Romania and I ended up meeting a girl who became my wife. And
Oh,
so
that's
in
nice.
2006, we got married, brought her over, and we have 4 kids. Um, but it wasn't really until I became a dad, but a dad of a girl, when our third child was born. That's our only girl. And when she was born, it just changed my perspective on the world. And I started to notice things in the world that with my 2 older boys, I just didn't notice because I'm like, they're boys, they're gonna be able to protect themselves. Um,
Exactly.
but when my girl was born, I started to think a little bit differently and have a different perspective as a dad. And it really shocked me because I have 8 sisters, so I was wondering what kind of perspective does my dad have raising 8 girls and protecting them. And that's about the same time when my wife was reading an article about the National Sex Ed Sit Out Day. And obviously, she did all of her schooling in Romania. She was an adult by the time we got married and moved here. And she was like, George, you went through the school system here. Tell me, what is this all about? And I'm like, I have no clue because I don't even know why we need a National Sex Ed Sit Out Day as a protest day for parents. So that started me on a journey of research and to try to understand what was school like during my time growing up and why is school different during this time. And so this was 5 years ago, and that led me to uncover some very horrific things of the trajectory of our public school system. And that's when, together with my friend Mark Schneider, who is an electrical engineer and a lawyer, um, we got together and we started this organization.
For those wondering, what does this topic have to do with us here in Romania? What's the idea of talking things with a guy from California about things that are not happening here? I'm sorry to say that the time when ideas travel slowly by coach or by steamboat is long gone. So nowadays, in the age of internet, whatever pops up in the collective mind of the people in the United States arrives here barely next day, and in Romania, especially in the recent months and years, we've seen the conversation around the idea of having sex ed as part of the national curriculum. So it's not something that affects only the United States. It's not something that is far removed from us. In fact, it is something that has grown to become a global movement. And we've seen there has been recently a scandal where we've seen the type of sexual education standards that are being pushed on us through UN and the World Health Organization, and it's clear to me that whatever is happening there is relevant, more and more relevant to us as well. And that's why I insisted on us having this conversation, because in a way you're opening our eyes to what's going to happen in the next few years. Because I am aware very much that California is at the forefront of this movement. The United States are a step ahead of us. Let's put it this way, but we're not far behind. So yeah.
That's very true. In fact, one of the early things when I started to uncover this and how it's happening in California, I asked myself, I'm like, these people, they're not just interested in doing it here, they must be interested in doing it everywhere. And really quickly, from the UN. It's a specific organization within the UN, the United Nations Education. It's called UNESCO, UNESCO, Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And they are the ones that developed a report called the International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education. And then the EU took that standard and developed it for Europe. And I actually have a copy of those EU standards, which they are starting to push in every country in Europe.
In fact, that guide has been translated into Romanian as well, so it's available for
Okay.
those trying to better understand what the politics is, what's their proposition. Because in fact, it is their proposition, and I'm as just I mentioned in our introduction, it is their right to have their own opinion and to try to push their own agenda, but they shouldn't be. Looking at us strangely when we push back or when we choose to have our own opinion and make a stand against their agenda. So, could you tell us what exactly is Protect Our Kids?
So, Protect Our Kids exists to inform and educate parents, first and foremost, and then pastors about the dangers to children in the public school system in America. And specifically, there are a lot of things, and we understand it takes, parents are very busy. So we need to help digest that information for them. So we call it the triple threat. And the first threat is sex and gender theory, and that is exhibited through comprehensive sexuality education. And then the second threat is critical race theory, and that's exhibited through these ideas that it's whites versus everybody else. There are oppressors and oppressed categories. And from here, it's not just about race, but it's about critical gender theory, critical sex theory, critical queer theory. Everything comes in place. And then the last threat, and the one that is really rearing its ugly horns right now in America, is called social emotional learning. And this is where the schools are trying to take a set of values and impose it into the conscience of the children in the school. And so, as soon as you don't hold those values, you get sent to the counselor's office and you need to get corrective training and corrective guidance. And well, maybe you, as the parent, are the one that is against this. So we're going to take the children away from you through child protective services. And really, you're not competent enough as a parent. And that's where this is going. So it's really a whole social engineering that's taking place right now within schools. So we're trying to inform parents and pastors about this triple threat, but we're also trying to give them solutions. And thankfully, we live in the United States where we still have a lot of freedoms. And there are many solutions that parents can take, anything from going to homeschooling, to private Christian schools, to micro schools. There are so many other options that parents have. And we want to teach them on how they can do that, both as parents, but then as pastors, to be able to protect the children within their church, to utilize the facilities and resources of the church to come alongside parents and protect these children.
You you did mention parents extensively. This makes me believe that you think parents should be in charge of the education of children, and even though they might do it in conjunction, in a partnership with the state through the education system, in the end, the parents are the ones that gave birth to the child, and they are the ones who should be responsible for for raising a child that has strong values and becomes ultimately a healthy member of our society. It's not the other way around. A society uh, raises you so you can be part of a normal family, whatever that means nowadays. Um, We tend to let ourselves be driven by emotions. In fact, we are told we should listen to our heart, protect our feelings. Yet this might be extremely dangerous since it distracts us from the measurable reality, because there is such a thing. Uh, what has been one of the most frightening statistics regarding our children and their education you have encountered?
Well, I'll just stick to two because there's many. But
Unfortunately,
unfortunately, but the very first one is literacy rates. I was shocked because when the United States started, back in 1776, with our Declaration of Independence, and then we fought the Revolutionary War, and then even within the first 50, 60 years, um, public education was not around. Education was done privately. Parents at home and churches took on that responsibility. In fact, it was really churches that started most of the universities that we have in the United States, especially the prominent ones.
yeah.
But the literacy rates during those times was well above 90%. Literacy rates today in the United States are hovering in the 70s. You would think that all of the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the introduction of public education for the state to take over, education, that it would maybe move that needle upwards, not downwards. But that needle has moved downwards significantly. And so parents, we share this statistic with parents in our conferences, and there's just like this huge gasp in the audience because nobody's willing to believe that. But you can just Google it very simply, literacy rates in the United States in the 1700s, and do it today in 2022, because we have the statistics from last year. You won't find anything from 2023 just yet. Um, but it's absolutely shocking. That number one tells you that overall the government does a very poor job at educating children.
Well, it
This,
makes sense in
yeah,
a way, because if I mean it's logical, at least to me. Who would you say is more incentivized to raise a child? A parent that has an emotional attachment, the strongest type of emotional attachment to their child, somebody that is invested in them from their birth, somebody that is with the child every day, or some bureaucrat in a far removed office somewhere thousands of miles away sometimes, who might have very good intentions, but it is in no way, shape, or form invested emotionally in the well-being of that child. So to me, it's easy to see why, if we abdicate the responsibility of education and we pass it to the government, we should not expect amazing results, since those people have no incentive, no actual need to have an educated population.
exactly. You hit the nail on the head. The family is the place where there is that loving, nurturing environment, and the vested interest, in order for the best interest of that child, and of the family to take place. Um, and so it's interesting how, too many parents abdicate that responsibility, and they think that a teacher, and what classroom sizes are today, usually well over 30 students, that somehow that teacher could do a better job, than a parent can.
You were about to mention a second sad statistic, to put it mildly.
Correct. And this one really ties into the mental health crisis that we have in America, that's really being driven by the transgender movement. And that is the current 13 to 17-year-olds, the high schoolers in America. Um, Almost 25% consider themselves transgender. They are neither male nor female. They are something other than the binary. And what's shocking for a country like the United States, which should be the most advanced nation, that should, understand scientific principles, and should understand scientific truths grounded in biology and chemistry. Here we have nearly a quarter of the student population in high school who are throwing that out the window, and they're saying that nope, I am something other than male or female, and that only stems from the indoctrination that's happening, because we don't see that in my generation. We
Exactly.
see that in previous generations, um, and so that is a shocking statistic.
For those that might believe this is normal, this is the outcome of liberation, of sexual liberation, of abolishing the norms, the oppressive norms. You just mentioned there are no such numbers in our generation and in the generation of our parents, and that doesn't make sense since we have the same kind of freedom. Why don't we see an uptick of numbers of transgender people in people in their 50s? Are they not entitled to have their genitals removed, or their transitioning paid for by the taxpayers? Why are children so much more predisposed to do this, if not due to the indoctrination and the shift in culture through education in the public schools? Yeah, it's frightening, and people should go
Exactly.
look at those numbers, because it's very clear once you see the gap, the huge gap, the discrepancy and numbers between generations.
And the other thing I'll just point out on both of these numbers, it's not because, I'm a Christian that I'm propagating this data. You can actually go and listen to some, nighttime, late night comedians like Bill Maher here in the United States, and probably one of the strongest atheists as well, who ridicules, Christians probably on a nightly basis, and yet he is talking about these kind of issues, and this statistic in particular. It doesn't make sense to him either, and so this just comes down to pure, reasoning, being rational human beings, and looking at the data, from a scientific standpoint and not from an ideological standpoint.
That's a very good point. I know over the years at Protect Our Kids, you have discussed at length about the avenues through which children are indoctrinated in schools. Could you give us a few examples and maybe briefly explain how they work? You did mention SEL. Um, could you go a little bit deeper on how
Sure.
that works?
Sure, yeah. So let me start off with the first threat, because this is the one that really started everything for us, which is the sex and gender theory. This is the one that they started a long time ago to slip into the curriculum. And so back when, in the 90s, when I was in school, what they would do is they would require you to have just sex education. And in there, you were supposed to learn about the anatomy and the biology of the human body, how everything works. Um, but there were no, values, pushed on you. Although, to a certain degree, we were also supposed to get taught about HIV and STDs and how to protect ourselves from it. And so, all of a sudden, they took their very first step, because they're very good incrementalists. The left does a really good job at just taking one step and another step, and they're very patient along the years. But one of what they started to do, this is now after, I got out of the school system, is they started to use the same terminology but redefine those same terms. So back in 2006, Planned Parenthood they went to the World Health Organization and they lobbied them to change the definition of the word sexuality. And instead of the word sexuality just being a reference to a person's sex, their biological sex, now it became this paragraph long definition of a person's sexuality, gender identity, gender expression, their thoughts, their fantasies, their behaviors. It just goes on and on and on. And this was one of the things that struck me when I started to read the law and when I started to read the curriculum. I'm like, the law is like 4 pages long. Where in the world do I see in the law that they're allowed to teach all of this craziness? Um, and the law didn't have to change. All that they had to do was change the definitions of the words in the law, which was a backdoor way of getting in there. So now all of a sudden, in the sex education class, you had students who were now being forced to do a condom relay race where they would put a fully erect male penis model on the, on a desk somewhere in the front of the class, and they would have condoms laid out there, and students would line up into two lines, and each line has to come in and rush and put a condom on that model, and then the next student until whoever wins first, and then yay, somebody gets a prize at the end. These are the kind of exercises they started to put into the curriculum because, well, we need to teach children how to put a condom on and how to do that in class. And oh, by the way, we're also going to teach them that if your parents insist on rigid gender roles, we're going to define that as spiritual abuse. And so, in the state of California, in the framework for how to teach this new sex education, the teachers are taught this definition of spiritual abuse.
Oh, wow. It's interesting because if you ask people if indoctrination is dangerous and if it's done in a Christian way, they'll definitely say we should stick away from that. And actually, in Romania, there is this big conversation around the idea that religion in school is dangerous. Yet, indoctrination in this form, in this using this method of muddying the waters when it comes to terminology, excessive language relativism seems just fine. And for those people that think these examples that you're giving us here are far fetched, again, just look through the standards proposed by UNESCO and by other bodies that governmental bodies that think they should be in charge of the education of our kids. On the other hand, here we are talking about these things publicly, plainly, since we know people should hear about these things. Yet, when these materials go on social media, the platforms will be asking us, "Hey, is this appropriate for children?" And we'll have to say, "No, probably this is not a conversation that a 6-year-old or an 11-year-old should watch on YouTube or on other platforms." Yet, it is just fine to teach it in public schools, even to first graders and maybe even younger kids. So there is this relativism that is clear and ridiculous if you compare it to standards being imposed on us, having a public conversation on a social media platform and on what the government is allowed to do through education with our kids.
If I would take the sex education curriculum, just that book, and take it next door to the child that's my neighbor, I would be convicted of a felony charge because
Rightly
I,
so.
rightfully so, okay, I would be convicted of a felony charge because I am distributing pornographic material to a child that is potentially grooming them, and I become a sexual predator. But as soon as I step into the walls of a school, I could do that as an adult with a child and groom them with all of these values, and I don't get charged as with a felony. That is the double standard currently in America.
I am aware you're not a teacher, yet I know you have a lot of interactions with parents association, with teachers, with educators, and also with politicians developing strategies and policies for our education system. Could you say that in the present form, our system of education is more focused on indoctrination than on education?
Most definitely, and this was something that I had to dig deep to figure out how does the education system work in America. And one of the most shocking things that I found out was that in the Communist Manifesto, which back in the 60s was read out loud on the US Senate floor in order for it to be transcribed into the National Archives forever. One of their goals was to get control of the education system by taking control of the unions, the teachers' unions specifically, because the teachers' unions, as you are probably maybe a little familiar with the history of America, with the Industrial Revolution, the rights of workers, unions started to be formed, all for very good reasons. But as society progressed and laws started to catch up with the industrialization, unions kind of lost really their initial purpose because everything was already taken care of through legislation. And the leftists, the Marxists in America, saw that as a very good bandwagon to jump on and to take advantage of, because this was free money. Every teacher is paying union dues, and those dues are actually quite large. For example, here in California, every year, every teacher gives about $1,300. You multiply that, and there's two large teachers union. One is called the California Teachers Association. They have about 325,000 members. So multiply 325,000 times 1,300, and
Almost half a billion dollars.
that's your budget every single year. And a lot of their budget today goes for political campaigns. In fact, like 99.9% of it goes to the Democratic Party. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. The teachers union have been taken over by left-wing ideologues, and so they are the ones that set up the agenda for of priorities for teaching. And as I started to uncover how the teachers union works, well, they are not the lawmakers, but they are putting the lawmakers in power due to their sheer influence and their sheer amount of financial power. So the teachers union places the lawmakers in place, and then they are the ones that write the laws that the lawmaker then will go in and push through the assembly and through the state senate. And so through this power, they are basically the ones that are, the puppet masters. They're holding and pulling all the strings. And so what we have seen, especially recently, is they've become very emboldened. So if it's taken them the last 10, 15 years to do, this whole sex and gender theory implementation, now just in the last 5 years, we've gone from dealing with critical race theory. And 2020, it hit really big time. We are now getting all of a sudden the next year revised history books that are taking history and revising it to say George Washington is bad, Abraham Lincoln, he didn't really want to free the slaves. He was just a closet racist and white supremacist. The whole, Revolutionary War, it wasn't, fought because we wanted freedom. We wanted to preserve our slaveocracy in America. And by the way, America didn't start with the 4th of July, 1776 Declaration of Independence. It actually began in 1619 when the first slave ship came to America. And so you have that. Then you have mathematics. In California, there was a whole new framework on mathematics that started to bring in critical theory into mathematics. Um, as if that's possible. How is that possible? Well, what they do is
Exactly.
they change every word problem. Johnny had 3 baskets of 8 apples each, and he gave away 2 of those baskets. How many apples does he have left? Well, that kind of a problem is now translated to, well, Johnny has 3 non-binary friends and 4 transgender friends. So everything became about the ideology. Every example was to perpetuate something from the Marxist ideologies. And so this is the kind of stuff that now all of a sudden, instead of seeing a slow change over 5, 10, 15 years, every year we get hit with something new.
I remember on a previous visit to actually to California, I remember being in a bookshop and looking at the um, shelves of books, especially at the part of dedicated to education. I could see how many of the titles of the books were focused on ideology instead of focusing on a topic. We're not talking about how to develop the literacy. We're talking about how to take whiteness out of, I don't know, philosophy or out of math. We're doing this in every single subject in our schools, and we see that especially in PE, which you would say is it should just help the child develop harmoniously a harmonious body. Yet now we see, or we're more keen to affirm the gender. Um, let me put it mildly, the gender confusion of others, even though a lot of children, especially girls, are, because you mentioned when you're a father of a girl, things change quickly. And we see so many girls being kicked out of competitions, or being losing in front of biological males, because all of a sudden it's more important for those males to be able to compete in whatever body they feel they belong to, instead of having a real competition that develops discipline, that develops those kind of traits that you would want in any healthy individual, especially for a society that should move forward, not go on tangents wherever they cannot have excuses to fail. It's
Exactly.
frightening. I'm going back to what you were saying about rewriting history, and in fact, I think we will see in Romania the same kind of attitude soon enough. And there are at at the present time, we already have people that are nostalgic about the communist times, as if any sane person could say those were better times than what we have now, with all our freedoms that come with responsibility and sometimes with dire consequences. And you have people that are nostalgic. On the other side, you have more and more people trying to rewrite the history, saying that communism wasn't that bad, it was just poorly implemented. It's like, if only Romania had had a different type of leader, a different type of communist dictator. Let's put it this way. Maybe things would have been differently. Maybe it would have been like France, 1968, and so on. It's
Well, I'm sure you're familiar with the Russian saying, "The future we know, it's the past that keeps on changing."
Yeah, Yeah, and at the pace at which we change the past is frightening, because for the past few decades, Howard Zinn's book on history, a revised history already, has been at the forefront of education in America. Yet it seems nowadays even Howard Zinn is not progressive enough. We need to change it with projects like 1619. That has been heavily debunked, yet people don't seem to care.
Well, it was a 99 page. Um, I guess I don't even know what to call it. I wouldn't even call it journalism. Uh, Number one, it was not history. There were no footnotes in the entire 99 pages. And some of the top black scholars and historians in America, such like Robert Woodson, they've come out and they've debunked all the lies. In fact, they've even written a book called um, Red, White, and Blue. Um, the saving America from the racist instigators, something like that was the title. And Robert Woodson led that charge, and he actually has now a program called the 1776 Unites Project, and to counteract the 1619 Project lies.
That's good, and it's a sign that people are waking up, and they're starting to understand what's at stake here. And some of us are even willing to speak up publicly about what's happening, and about the fact that something should be done. We should react, at least react. um while you spend most of your life in the United States, as you mentioned at the beginning of this program, you were born in communist Romania, and I'm sure you have memories of those times. Would you say the education system in California, specifically, because you're very much familiar with what's happening there, gravitate towards what we used to have here in before 1989, before the revolution?
I would say so. And even though I was too young to go through the education system in Romania, I'm the eighth of 12 kids. So all of my older siblings went through at least 2, 3 years, all the way through 12th grade. My oldest sister, did her high school there. And then my dad, being the eldest of 10. So I and all of my aunts and uncles are here in the United States. So I have access to at least 20 something people who went through the education system in Romania. And what's frightening right now about California is that over and over, the one thing that had happened to my older siblings and my parents and my aunts and uncles is starting to happen here. You probably have heard stories like, first day of class. Well, we're gonna, my dad and all of my older siblings, um, the teachers would say, well, all the Christians stand up. And okay, now we know the Christians. The teachers would give the right to all the other students to make fun of them the rest of the school year. Um, so those kind of things are happening here through social emotional learning. I remember during COVID, when we were having to switch to online school with our kids, and at that time my two older boys were in the public schools, and one of the lessons that they got in social emotional learning was, we're going to learn kindness today, children. And I'm like, okay, I want to see where this goes.
Well, it sounds promising, at least
It,
at face value.
yeah, it sounds promising. Well, all of a sudden, this is in sixth grade. The teacher took the conversation and she said, well, you might have a classmate that is, gay or bisexual or transgender. And, if you don't affirm what they believe about themselves, you are not being kind. Um, and so those kind of values, are clearly being ingrained and indoctrinated into children. And whenever a child will stand up, for example, in my in the church, this was 4 years ago now. One of the guys in our youth team, he was in high school at that time, and one of his high school professors, insisted that they would not call him sir, but call him ma'am. And he would just always say, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, to the point where that teacher started to raise his voice and saying, no, you will address me as ma'am. And he couldn't do that. You're biologically a male. I can't call you something other than a male. Um, but this is how brazen that they are, and they use these to naturally weed out and display, well, who is really, a Christian, who is not ideologically on our side. And so it forces people and students into a corner very quickly.
Um, it's interesting. You mentioned all these things, and they, while you were talking, in my mind, it popped all those strategies used by the Communist Party and by the leaders, the educators of that time, where you had this class system, where you had the classical bourgeoisie, where people with money were seen as being problematic, where you would have sessions where you were affirming the work, or where you would praise the state for providing you with everything, and you would build a cult of personality around the idea that there is an oppressor, and all the oppressed should rise up and be liberated, and that always requires an oppressor, and you would always find an oppressor in different categories, just like you mentioned. You stand up if you're a Christian. How about you stand up if you have your own house in the city? Or how about you raise up if your parents are intellectuals, because we don't need the likes of you among us. Or even if we cannot kick you out, we will uh, we will make sure everybody knows that you are dangerous. And
Correct.
we've seen what that has led. In fact, Ceausescu wanted God out of schools, out of communities, out of the country, and unfortunately, we see a similar behavior both in the United States and increasingly in Romania. Why do you think that is? Is this their way of admitting that their values clash with the Christian morality?
Well, if you go back to um, Marx's disciples with the Frankfurt School, when after Marx died, his disciples were actually pretty distraught because Marxism wasn't catching a good, foothold anywhere but in the East, and they were questioning, why isn't it working in the West? Well, in the West, you had a very large middle class. And because Marx initially focused heavily on applying his ideology to economics, which is communism, it was always about the struggle of the classes. And in the West, you had a third very large class. You didn't have just the poor and the wealthy. So it never caught hold there. But Antonio Gramsci, who is one of his disciples, and he was an Italian guy, um, he specifically said this in his prison cell because Mussolini, as a fascist, ended up putting him in prison. And he said, in order to transform the consciousness of society, we actually have to cut Christianity out in the West, because Christianity, they understood that it was the Judeo Christian values that were at the root of everything that the Western civilization stood on. And so that's why I believe, even here in America, back from the 70s, Everybody's very familiar with the abortion case at the Supreme Court, Roe versus Wade, right? But right before that, the year before that, they removed prayer from public schools. And the question is like, why something as, you know, harmless as prayer? It's just a person saying words. Why does the Supreme Court of the United States, why are there a group of people who care so much for people not to pray, for students not to pray, for teachers not to pray? Because the spirit that leads the other side is a satanic spirit, and Satan could care less about Buddhism, about Islam, about everything else, because he already knows that is those are his other decoys.
Yeah.
So he only cares about fighting the truth, and Christianity is the one and only truth, and that's why they go so hard after this. But thank God we've had some pretty promising results over the last 5 to 10 years here in America, and actually one of them was just in the last year, where the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Coach Kennedy. Coach Kennedy was a Marine for 20 years. He then went into public schools and became a football coach. And on his own, he wasn't inviting his football players, his students, nobody else. But after every game, he would take a knee at the 50-yard line and he would just silently pray. And he was sued for that, and he was fired for that from his school. And so that lawsuit took many years to go through the court system, but last year the Supreme Court ruled in his favor, and now that um, that new ruling by the Supreme Court is going to have reverberations through the entire public education system, because it's going to change the way that laws have been interpreted up until now. So thank God that there's also pieces of good news for us here in America.
For those among our listeners who think things are not that bad, the case you just mentioned, Coach Kennedy's case, is a very good example of what is this considered to be disturbing for our society and what is considered valuable. Because on one hand, you have a guy kneeling and praying a personal prayer in front of others, but uh, without indoctrinating others. On the other hand, you have drag shows for kids that are being considered healthy, that are being considered valuable for the development of these kids. And as I said, on one hand, that is considered to be dangerous. On the other hand, we see what is considered to be valuable. And we will continue to see these kind of contrasts where what used to be good just merely a few years back or decades now is considered to be dangerous. What was considered to be debauchery, what was considered to be obscene, perverse just merely a few years back now is promoted through every channel, through every company, through every event and occasion, and especially in systems that are being governed by bureaucrats that have their own agenda with no regard for the well-being of kids and their families. We
Exactly.
we talked a lot about the system, yet children are born to parents. Um, at least that's still the norm until we will be told that children should be born artificially, who knows how. Why do you think so many of these parents abdicate from their responsibility to raise, to educate, and to model the lives of their children? When exactly did we shift from children being the responsibility of the parents and the family towards it should be the state who raises them?
Well, I think the progression here in America really started off with the generation after World War II. The generation during World War II was actually labeled here in America as the greatest generation because they survived the Great Depression. They then had to go off and fight not just Nazi Germany, but then also go in the Pacific and fight against the Japanese Empire at that time. Um, they were basically fighting an impossible war. And from there, these men came back from the war completely, I guess, just depleted of any energy. And that's when their children, which are the baby boomers in America, started to ask for all of this sexual liberation. And they started to say, you know what, we don't want to be like our parents. Well, they asked for that. And then their generation, the baby boomer generation, became the parents of what is called Gen X, who were born in the 70s and the early 80s. Um, and the Gen X generation started to live as kids, with the boomer generation being their parents. And these boomers started um, to see divorce rates go up because, again, they didn't want to, follow the traditional norms. From there, they went on to where Gen X became parents, and all of a sudden, my generation, the millennial generation, Generation Y, we grew up, in households where 50% of marriages ended up in divorce. And so all of a sudden, you took this step by step through these last three generations where you've disintegrated the family. You don't have this notion of marriage between a man and a woman and the responsibilities of a husband and a wife towards their children. And you have, as a result, all of these social programs that started. Why? Because there were so many single mothers. And what was started as a social program, as what should have been always known as the exception, not the rule, now all of a sudden became the rule. And so the state, with all of its social programs, saying, well, wait up, single moms can't do this alone. Well, yes, of course they can't do it alone. They should have their husband. And if they don't have a husband, it's the man who they had that child with that should pay, child alimony and child support and be there for them. And so it's taken the last 60 to 70 years, but here we are today. And so the generation that is the parents of today, they've grown up in broken homes, and more than likely their grandparents grew up in broken homes. And they don't have this notion anymore that children belong to parents, and it is their responsibility to raise them and to impart their own values and not the state's values to them.
You mentioned about the social programs, especially in the early '60s and then '60s and '70s. And it's interesting because if you look at what kind of problems those programs try to solve, you see that the results actually went in the opposite direction. And it's strange because if you would have the same kind of results, the same kind of approach in any other field, you would be considered a failure. If you would go to a doctor telling them, "Hey, I have a, I don't know, a 39 or 100 Fahrenheit fever," and you tell the doctor, "I want to feel better," and they start treating you, and your fever jumps up, you're like, "Okay, you're not doing a good job. You're pushing me in the wrong direction." Or if you go to a bank telling them, "Hey, I have troubles with my business. I need a loan to lower my financial burdens," and they're like, "Okay, here's some money," and you end up with more debt. You're like, "Okay, something's not working." Yet somehow with the government, we let them fly with these kind of programs as if they were the ones that mentioned the problem. They were the ones coming up with the solution, and when they failed, they told us, "Well, it wasn't our fault. Let's try more. Let's do more of these same failures."
It's never enough. And in fact, Thomas Sowell really does a good job of hyper focusing on the African American community and the absolute devastation that these social programs had on generation after generation, you know, pre World War II, and pre any of these social programs, and even during the Jim Crow era, and even before, during slavery, the 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 family structure within Black communities was much much stronger than it is right now post all of these social programs. And so, yeah, parents and just concerned citizens really need to educate themselves and read some of these, these findings which Thomas Sowell has in his books, or you could just listen to some of his interviews on YouTube, and it's very eye-opening.
We talked a lot about problems, and maybe it's time we talk about solutions. I wanted to ask you, since Romania is starting to see an uptick in homeschooling, is the fast growing homeschool movement merely a reaction, a response to the aggressive indoctrination in our public schools, or is it actually a healthy alternative?
Probably about, I would say, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, people would say that uh, these homeschooling kids are going to end up being completely destroyed. Parents are ruining their lives, ruining their future. And in fact, what we see now is quite the opposite. Um, I have, so for example, my friend Mark Schneider, who is our president of Protect Your Kids. He homeschooled both of his kids. Um, his son is at UCLA. Um, you know, I think most homeschooling kids that I know have gotten into some prominent university. Their test scores are much, much higher on the average than public school kids. What's interesting now is that especially the top universities in America are starting to do outreach to the homeschool community to get these kids to come to their school, because it's always in the best interest of every one of these universities, right? To get children that will then go on and be successful in life, so that way they can claim that their alumni are, the CEO and such organization, right? Well, now there is a huge movement to attracting homeschoolers to these top universities in America. So the homeschooling movement in America has been growing steadily for the last 40 years. And I believe that these are the kids that are going to save America, because they have been spared the indoctrination. They've been taught through the classics, through classical literature. They've been, focusing all of their attention on the sciences, on the mathematics, and on excelling in all of these areas. One really nice thing that happened through COVID is that parents were able to see, you know, firsthand what children were being taught, and the rate of homeschooling now has gone way up. And what's very interesting is that it's not within the white community, but within the Black community and the Latino community, that the rates of homeschooling, it's not like they doubled or tripled. We're talking like 10 times. Uh, Parents are starting to see the truth that the public education system in America is broken. It's all about indoctrination, it's all about politics, and it's not about education, and they're taking matters into their own hands. And so this is a very, very good model, even for parents in Romania to follow.
Nice you mentioned Romania, because in recent years, especially in the age of the internet, we've seen how fast cultural and political influences travel. And based on that, and on the recent examples, what we've seen in Romania as well, I am afraid we will see the same kind of struggles in Romania, like the ones you have today in California, the ones that you mentioned. Do you have any advice maybe for the concerned parents in Romania? I know Protect Our Kids has a YouTube channel with valuable information, but maybe from your experience and maybe from your encounters through the Protect Our Kids, maybe you could give us some advice.
Yeah. Well, for first of all, I highly encourage parents to go to protectourkidsnow.org and to just go through a lot of the videos that we have created there. There's actually one of the videos is in Romanian. It's about 12 minutes long, so it's not that long. It's very short. Um, you can go through the brochures that we have under our brochures tab, and even if you can't read English, you'll at least be able to see the examples and the pictures. I think that will translate well. Um, but in terms of advice for what to do, not just to find the problems, but to enact solutions, I would start off from the homeschooling standpoint. Um, there is so much material out there that has been developed over the last 30 to 40 years, and especially with the advent of the internet, all of it is accessible now online. Um, so, parents in Romania, I hope that there will be parents that will not just do this with their own kids, but start to open organizations that will train and teach other parents on how to do this, partner with organizations here from the USA, and translate a lot of this material. Especially, I would encourage parents to look at the classical Christian model of education, the classical Christian model of education, because that, and I have a study actually that was done. It was a long-term study that tracked students over not just their time as students, but also well into their adulthood. And they looked at the difference between classical Christian model, the classical secular model, the uh, private school model versus the public school model. And in all areas of life, in which they determined certain criteria of success within that study, the classical Christian school model students by far outpaced everyone else. And so if parents in Romania could take advantage of what we've learned here in America and apply that, but I would also take it a step further. Don't just limit yourself to homeschooling. Find ways to start Christian private schools through the church networks. Do whatever you can to build um, schools within churches. And here's one very interesting thing that I learned. There was an author by the name of Vishal Mangalwadi, and he wrote the book called The Third Education Revolution. And in it, he makes the claim that the church has forgotten and has lost its calling when it comes to education, because the church was given the assignment in the Great Commission of Matthew 28 18 through 20 to go and to make disciples and to teach them. So education should be part of our mandate as Christians, as believers. How do we educate people? Well, our God is the creator of everything, including reading and writing and science and mathematics and everything. So we are to utilize all of the things within God's creation to be able to teach. And he looked at how the church throughout all of history um, has always taken this very seriously, but for some reason, the modern church has lost that sense of commitment to education as part of the Great Commission. And so he was just trying to encourage pastors, especially, to take back education. As I've mentioned in the start of this podcast, um, in America, pre, let's say, 1860s, 1870s, when public the public school system started to be formed, education was done at home and at church. And we had some of the brightest inventions and brightest minds. Um, and yet, here we are for some reason thinking that if we don't have a public school system, our society is going to crumble. Um, that's what the left wants you to think, but that is not true. Some of the most brilliant minds graduated Harvard at 14 years old, and yet all they had access to was the very simple one room, schoolhouse in the local church. Um, and so we need to come back to some of those fundamentals again as parents and as pastors.
Thank you very much, George. Here at the Edictum Dei, we strive to offer the public meaningful conversations, ideas to put in front of them, ideas that are worth listening to, and of course, we would love to see the public listening and adopting our Christian conservative values. Yet we know we need to have a meaningful dialogue. And I think today what we had here was a fruitful discussion about what is happening in the educational system. Maybe like a peek into the future, because as I said, things in Romania will be changing in the near future, just as they have changed in the past decade in the United States. And I think this conversation of ours was eye-opening, and it offered many people the opportunity to hear what has happened before, and maybe stir them into looking for themselves into what are the dangers, what are the solutions, and how can we move forward in a way that eventually will bring about a healthy society with nuclear families that are strong, with children raised to become successful people, not victims, and in the end, a society that flourishes, that advances, not one that seems to be so keen on destroying itself. Thank you very much for taking your time to have this conversation, and who knows, maybe we'll get to talk more in the future, maybe on the ways we can do more for Romania, more that can help the families, the church, the children, and our society as a whole. Thank you very much,
Really
George.
appreciate it. Really appreciate it, Mate. God bless you guys.
Have a good night.